Hey guys, let's talk about books. This week hopefully is a little more, little less scattered than last week, which was a bit of a chaos party, wasn't it? There is currently a massive thunderstorm happening around my house. So if the camera picks up the thunder, it's not my tummy, it's the thunder. It is massive and the wind is coming from all directions. So of course the rain is coming in sideways in multiple directions. So that was really exciting for me when I was at work and I knew that my windows at home were open for the cats and the rain was coming in sideways. I was a bit worried about the state of my furniture and my carpets when I got home, but it's all okay. It's fine. The cats, of course, are unhappy at the state of the thunder. They sit just over there while I'm filming and supervise the shenanigans. This week has not really been a reading week, but of course I have read things. The main thing that has happened outside reading for me this week is I launched my business online. A soft launch. I didn't super announce it or anything. I have opened a shop selling pens and notepads and basically all the things you use in your everyday life, but nice versions, because you still have to write a shopping list. You may as well use a pen that's nice and paper that's nice and just makes you feel good about the mundane tasks in your day. If you're interested, I will leave a link below. I'm shipping to Australia and New Zealand currently, and that's probably the only time I will mention it here on my channel. But it's huge, exciting news and I want to share it. And now let's talk about, books with words in rather than books you have to put words in. This week I finished reading listening to Odyssey by Stephen Fry. I said last week I was getting really sick of Fry's narration because of the performance of it and the depth of concentration that it required from me. Ultimately, it was fine. It was perfectly cromulent. It was a retelling of the Odyssey in a simplified and more modern way that's, I felt, really accessible. That criticism I mentioned a few weeks ago about women in the Odyssey, it was an article from The Conversation, which I'll link again below, held up for me in that there were no women in here except to serve the men, which Kelly pointed out in the comments of one of these videos might be different in the Emily Wilson translations of both Odyssey and the Iliad, which I will link to below. So it would be interesting to compare those. Obviously I can't read either text in the original, but it would be interesting to compare translations. The big thing that stood out for me here was actually the final chapter of Odyssey, which is the kind of chapter that makes you want to buy the physical book and have it as a reference, talking about Odyssey in modern culture and the way that it's been interpreted in lots of types of story. The quest to go home, the nostalgia quest in literature and movies and stuff like that, and of course talking about Ulysses. And I had been thinking right at the end of the story where Odysseus gets home to Ithaca and to Penelope and to Telemachus, his oldest son, and all that part with his son especially really helped me understand Ulysses so much better. So having more context for Ulysses has helped me gain a better perspective on Ulysses, which is obvious in hindsight, isn't it, that would happen. But I'm glad that did, especially the character of Stephen Dedalus and his place in relation to Leopold Bloom in Ulysses. If you're not familiar with Ulysses, I have a whole reading blog about it, which I will link below. So I really enjoyed that about the Odyssey, and then this chapter at the end giving context to modern interpretations of the Odyssey, I thought was great, and overall would recommend. Yeah. Would maybe not to buy, but definitely to consume. I'm currently still reading. I have a pile. My bedtime reading is Papyrus. I am further through than this would indicate because I'm actually reading it on my Kindle, because that's how bedtime reading works for me. What am I thinking? Actually, I highlighted something. Where's my phone? I highlighted something last night that really struck me, and so maybe I'll share it with you. Let me find annotations. Basically, what we're up to now is, because it's history of books, the invention of books, we are at the cusp of oral tradition morphing into written tradition, how things like Homer gain something but mostly lose something by writing it down, because the oral tradition of bards and poets and storytellers is a living tradition. You have the outline of the story, but each telling of it and each teller of it changes the story. So that's the context of where this highlight came from. It says, if somebody reads to you aloud, they want you to experience pleasure. It's an act of love and a truce in the midst of life's battles. And I liked that. So I'm progressing with Papyrus. I started listening on Spotify to Midnight in Chernobyl by Adam Higginbotham. Now, we haven't talked about Challenger, so I'll talk about Challenger. Where's Challenger? A couple of weeks ago, I listened to Challenger by Adam Higginbotham. This is new release, and it is about the Challenger space disaster of 1983. Oh, it does not say on the back. What did the chapter say? 1986. It's amazing. If you are interested in the Challenger disaster and what happened, why it happened, the impact of it, it was great. It read like a thriller. It was like a movie in that we get the cast of characters, what everybody's up to, how they come to be involved in the space program. There was context of previous space disasters with the death of people. And then you'd get the story of, we're getting towards people training to go up on Challenger. We've got the teacher, Christine McAuliffe, who was a civilian, selected to go up on Challenger. And then we have the engineers and all these people. And then the O-rings. The O-rings are the things that didn't function properly that caused Challenger to explode on entry into space. But it would be like, all these things are happening and then the O-rings. All these things are happening and then the O-rings were ignored. Or somebody tried to do something about it, but it didn't get escalated high enough in the bureaucracy, or it wasn't a problem, or it was a problem, but the definition of how much of it was a problem got reduced as it moved through the levels. And then it would come back to the O-rings and what are the O-rings doing? And it was like a movie, like a CGI scene you can see of the camera panning through the shuttle and then the O-ring failing. So that was super tense, even though, of course, you know what's going to happen. And then the book talked about the aftermath of Challenger, why it was such a big cultural disaster moment for the US in particular, because this happened when I was a child. I was 3 years old. So it's always been part of pop cultural memory for me, but the impact of it and why it was such a big deal beyond, people dying, that put it in context for me, which was great. So I picked up Midnight in Chernobyl. I'm listening to it on Spotify, but I happened to be near a bookstore waiting for the doctor the other day, and this happened to fall into my bag. in exchange for currency, obviously. So Midnight in Chernobyl is about the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, and they both 1986. Interesting. Anyway, less interesting. This came out in 2019. Adam Higginbotham again, and this one is very similar vibes in the way that he's setting up the story, except the disaster happens earlier in the story here. There's a lot of, actually in both books, a lot of technical detail about what is crucial about this thing and how it's gone wrong and why it went wrong. And in this one, of course, that's one, USSR. So all of those levels of bureaucracy, it's how nuclear reactors function, how reactor 4 at Chernobyl was different from the other reactors, different types of radiation and the way that it affects the body and what can go wrong, and lots of technical detail in this one that basically I haven't absorbed at all. And that's fine. It's like when I read science fiction, I do better with science fiction when I listen to it, because when it gets into technical details, the story doesn't stop and wait for me to catch up. It just keeps going. And I know enough to understand what's going on, or the story keeps giving me context about this is good, this is bad. That is happening here. So I am that far in. It's about 30%. And the reactor has exploded. It's not there anymore. People are dying of radiation sickness already. So again, we've got the cast of characters, the way the information is traveling through the bureaucracy. I'm enjoying it. It's good to listen to. I listen to Challenger as well. Basically, what I've got from this so far is, again, a preventable disaster if only people had been more interested in losing their jobs. Although, to be fair, in Soviet Russia and the Soviet states, you would go to prison or be killed. You wouldn't just lose your job. So there's that, I suppose. So that's what I'm reading. Midnight in Chernobyl is the only book that I picked up this week, obviously. It is call number 3631799099477, which is a very specific call number relating to nuclear disasters in the Ukraine. Who would have thunk it? The call number for Challenger would have been on screen, but it's 629.45, which is manned spaceflight disasters or manned spaceflight. The call number for Papyrus, which also would have been on screen, is 002.09, which I think is the history of paper or the history of books. Must be the history of books. I've got other books in the category. That's where we're at. A nice short one. Thank you for hanging out with me while I get into nonfiction November. I have skipped a lot of books that weren't reviewed while I was taking a break from YouTube earlier this year, but hopefully I'll catch up on them, just like Challenger. And of course, it's nonfiction November. It's nice to be reading and talking about nonfiction books. If you have any questions about the things that I've been reading, if you have any comments or suggestions, I'd love to hear it. I'm really, really interested in these two in particular, the Higginbothams, because they are modern history. And I know very little about modern history, and Higginbotham is such an evocative writer. Reads like an extended essay, which I guess it is, but definitely readable and accessible even in the technical details. So if you have any suggestions of modern history that is along those accessible lines, that is not about war, because that's so boring, I'd love to hear it. And I will see you next week.